we're going to begin reading at verse 31. Exodus chapter 12, beginning to read at verse 31. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewellery and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they had brought out of Egypt. For it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watchkeeping. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised it. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones. All the congregation of Israel shall keep it. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and will keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you." All the people of Israel did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. And on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the people of Israel, both of man and beast, is mine." Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this service in this month. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen with you, and no leaven shall be seen with you in all your territory. You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand, and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and shall give it to you, you shall set apart to the Lord all that first opens the womb. All the firstborn of your animals that are males shall be the Lord's. Every firstborn of a donkey you shall redeem with a lamb. Or if you will not redeem it, you shall break its neck. Every firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. And when in time to come your son asks, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that first opened the womb, but all the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be as a mark on your hand, or frontlets between your eyes, or by a strong hand, for by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest the people change their mind when they see war and return to Egypt. But God led the people round by the way of the wilderness towards the Red Sea. And the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt, equipped for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. And they moved on from Sukkot and encamped at Etham, on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. Well, we're going to sing again. Exodus chapter 12, verse 31. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, up, go out from among my people. Now, if you listen to that, but you didn't have the words in front of you, you might have a different image in your head to the one that happened. Because maybe you imagine a medieval soldier riding up on horseback with shining armour, and he declares and unrolls a scroll to say, you are summoned. But it is not night with a K. It's night with an N. In the middle of the night, somebody is sent to Moses and Aaron. And what's the first thing that they say? Rise up, or get up. The image I have is of somebody standing outside the front door in the dead of night, banging on the door, expecting those inside to be asleep in bed. Get up! Get up! Why is it important to note that? I think for two reasons. One, God is not slow to act. When the time comes to move, it can't wait until Monday morning. It happens now. And secondly, the people needed to be ready for this moment. And we need to be ready as well. Imagine you're an Israelite in Egypt. You're in slavery. You don't have much freedom, and in many ways, life is hard. You've experienced genocide. You're excluded from much in Egyptian society. You have to work incredibly hard just to exist. And yet, through it all, ultimately, so far, you've survived. Here comes Moses, this man who says he's been sent by God, and that he will set the people free. Or God will set the people free through him. That you will be set free. There have been these plagues. But each time, Pharaoh has resisted. In fact, in Exodus chapter 5, as a direct result of Moses asking for your freedom, life for you got harder. You're no longer given all the raw materials you needed for your job. You need to go out and find some of them yourself, and yet you still have the same quotas to meet. How do you think the Israelites may have felt coming up to chapter 12? I mean, you've not just been in slavery for a few months or even a few years. You've been in slavery in Egypt for generations. I think it might have been tempting to think, hey, Moses, don't mess with the status quo. I mean, things aren't great, but they could also be a lot worse. For generations, you have witnessed firsthand the might of the Egyptians. You've been born into slavery and have only ever known it. Maybe you've become institutionalized. It seems impossible to imagine a different life to the one that you have experienced. And it must have been tempting, maybe, to question whether leaving was really such a good idea. And after all the plagues and the extra hardship, maybe it was starting to seem like maybe God wasn't going to set them free after all. But at the Passover, something different is happening. Consider some of the small details. When the Israelites are instructed about the Passover, we read in Exodus 12:11 last week that they are to celebrate it with their belts fastened, their sandals on their feet, and their staffs in their hand. They're also told to eat in haste, and no leftovers are to remain until the morning. Instead, they're to burn any leftovers that night. So don't go leaving the dishes until the morning. Not only that, but in chapter 12, we have this section where God is telling Moses what the people are to do. And it's clear, isn't it, that this day you will be free. Do you see how this is different to what has happened previously? Do you see how that context impacts on the passage we're reading tonight? The Israelites are celebrating the Passover, dressed, ready to go. By the time the Passover happens, they've eaten their meal and they've cleaned up. And then in the middle of the night, there is this call for them to get up and leave. Do you remember a few weeks ago when Josh spoke about the plagues? Can you remember the questions that he asked? One of the questions was, were each of the plagues a failed attempt at rescue? Do you remember that? That's the way he phrased it. Do you remember that question? Because you could read that and you think, why? All of these things God is doing, and yet each time the people are not set free. Well, if you go back and listen to Josh's talk, you'll hear the answer to that. But we can well imagine Israelites may have felt like that was the case, can't we? They might have been tempted to think that God was failing in his efforts to free them. It might have been tempting not to take Moses so seriously, not to be ready, not to be prepared. But suddenly, now, God is telling them that this day you are leaving, so get ready. The Israelites had to believe God, and they had to be ready. In verse 40, we read that they left Egypt 430 years to the day that they arrived. 430 years to the day that they arrived. I mean, that's some coincidence, isn't it? You'd almost think it was planned. That's sarcasm. Definitely was. Through all the plagues, the people may have questioned, why is this taking so long? Why is what God is doing, why doesn't it seem to be working as quickly as we might like? And yet we see that in the end, God is not slow to act. And everything he plans does happen at exactly the time it's supposed to, and in exactly the way that it's supposed to. So as I said, firstly, we see that God is not slow to act. Even though it might look like things are not going according to plan, we can know that in the end we will look back and see that God has always been in control and nothing has ever taken him by surprise. And secondly, the people needed to be ready. Let's go back to the start of the passage we're looking at, verse 32 of chapter 12. Take your, chapter 12, verse 31, let's read 31. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, go up from among my people, both you and your people and the people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. They've gone from asking permission to leave to being evicted in the middle of the night. It's Quite a turnaround, really, isn't it? You know, it seems like there's been nothing in the news for the last decade now but Brexit, doesn't it? Can you imagine that after all the campaigns, after the referendum, after the first stage of negotiations, and the EU turned around and if they just said, do you know what, actually, we don't want you to stay. Get out now! No time to talk about how we're going to do it. No time to plan. No transition period. You're out tonight. Can you imagine the chaos of such a sudden move? It's a silly illustration. But you see my point. This turnaround happens quickly and is extreme. We go from Pharaoh insisting the people must stay to Pharaoh saying, not only are you free to leave, but you have to leave and you have to leave now. I love the end of verse 32. Maybe this shows us that Pharaoh finally understands something of God's power. He's seen God's destructive force. And he does not want the Israelites to curse him as they leave. And so instead he asks for their blessing. He says, yes, go now, and also bless me. If you think about it, if the plagues are God's way of persuading Pharaoh, then what would God's punishment look like? Once the Israelites are gone, what stands in the way of God's full fury falling on Egypt? After all, how did some of the plagues finish? They finished when Moses prayed to God. We heard last week, Moses has told Pharaoh he will not see him again. So Pharaoh asking for the people's blessing, I think, is significant. Verse 33. The Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste. For they said, we shall all be dead. The promise God had made to Abraham was that his people would be a nation through whom all nations on the earth would be blessed. But in order for God's people to bless the world, they needed to be in God's place at God's time. By remaining in Egypt any longer, the Israelites would have brought death rather than a blessing to Egypt. But the Exodus led to the establishment of the nation of Israel. And as a result of that, we got the line of David, and ultimately we got Christ, Jesus, who came and died so that all nations on the earth would be blessed, including Egypt. I don't know if there's anyone here tonight who's from Egypt, but if we were a group of Egyptian believers, then we would be so grateful tonight that the Israelites did leave. So grateful that God made them into that nation. So grateful that he provided the Messiah. So grateful that Jesus suffered and died in our place. Verse 34. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. Again, see the urgency here. Time is tight. The people need to move. This is why it was so important they be ready. Verse 35 to 36. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them. For they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewellery and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. It's an interesting detail, isn't it? The Israelites plundered the Egyptians as they left. They were very polite in the way that they did it. They asked for the stuff and the Egyptians gave it. But you see the picture here that the Egyptians have gone from the lowest of the low. The Israelites have gone from the lowest to lowest society, the slaves. All of a sudden, the next day they are gone, and so are the riches of Egypt. Verse 37. The people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. This was a journey probably of around about 120 miles. Has anyone ever gone on holiday in the middle of the night? You might have done. Got up 1 a.m. to beat the traffic down to Cornwall? It can be stressful, can't it? It's quieter on the road at that time. Don't get me wrong, get everyone organised and getting down there. Stressful. How about moving a house in the middle of the night? At a moment's notice. On foot. and knowing that you're never going to come back to the place that you're moving from. And look, there were about 600,000 men. So this is no small operation, isn't it? It's bad enough organising a family of 5 into a people carrier at 1 a.m, I expect it is. But this is on a whole other scale. 600,000. And that's just the men. You might think, well, 600,000 men, let's say, probably means 600,000 women. Say half of them are at childbearing age with 2.4 kids. That's 720,000 children. That's around about 1.92 million people. But actually, that's probably an underestimation, because don't forget that Moses ended up in the Nile because Pharaoh wanted to kill the male children. So depending on the success of that genocide, the chances are there are more women than there are men. And also, they probably had more than 2.4 kids per family. Regardless, 1.92 million, probably a low estimation. What does that look like? Can you imagine that sort of crowd? Well, it probably looks like what we've seen on the news outside of Manchester Airport, doesn't it, at the moment? Those big queues for security because of whatever problems are going on there. No, in all seriousness, do look at Manchester Airport, because in the month of April, 1,890,981 people went through Manchester Airport. Maybe some of you were in that number. So imagine the queue for Manchester Airport not moving for an entire month. That's probably the sort of number that we're looking at here. Or put it another way, the Stade de France has a capacity of 81,338. So that's about 23.6 Stade de France's. Not a simple operation. I mean, can you imagine this being any more complicated? In the middle of the night, moving that quantity of people? Can it be even worse? Verse 38. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. Oh yeah, it was even more complicated, because they had the animals as well. Why am I highlighting this? I want us to understand that this is a real event that happened, and it's a huge thing. Both for the Israelites and for the Egyptians. The population of Wales is just over 3 million about it. Imagine losing half of that overnight. Oh, and the population that are leaving, by the way, they're the underpaid and overworked masses. We can start to see why Pharaoh might come to regret his decision in a few chapters. I want us to see this as a real event, because I want us to understand both the scale of God's rescue and also the inevitable difficulties that his people would endure. Such a huge group leaving at the drop of a hat to travel by foot. We know the problems that the Israelites will face because we've read the rest of Exodus. We know that God is going to look after them. In fact, look at verses 17 to 18, where we see that God cares for his people. He takes them a different route because he can see that if they go the easiest route, then they might see war and turn back. So God is going to look after them, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. The reason why that's important is because I think Exodus gives us a picture for us of an even greater Exodus which was still to come. And also a picture of what it means to follow God ourselves, to repent, to turn away from a life of sin and to live a life of following God. To leave behind one way of life and to pursue another. It is without question that the Exodus happened entirely because God acted. It is also true that the Israelites also had to act faithfully, and they had to endure hardship in order for it to happen. We may not be called to leave our city or our country to follow our God, but he has provided for us a rescue from our sin. And he has called us, if we are Christians, to leave behind our old way of life and to live our lives as his people. We can't do that without God working a miracle in our lives. But it also means that life won't always be plain sailing. There will be difficulties and there will be challenges. And when we face these, we should remember the Exodus. We should remember that God was not slow to act. That everything did happen exactly as he planned. That he was faithful to his people. And that they needed to trust him and be ready to do what he said. To look even further ahead. While I don't think that God has called us necessarily as Christians to leave our country, although of course some are called to overseas mission, and that is what they do. That's not every Christian. I do believe that one day there will be an exodus, if you will, when every Christian will be called away. You see, each of us one day will either be called out of this world when we die, or will be called out of this world to join Christ when he returns. In the New Testament, the second coming of Christ is something which we are told will happen quickly, immediately, irreversibly, and unexpectedly. I say unexpectedly, not that it's not expected, because it is expected, but that nobody knows the day or the hour it will happen. It will happen. We don't know when. In the middle of the night, suddenly the Israelites were called to leave their lives, to uproot their families, abandon their homes, and walk off into the unknown, trusting God. Of course, the future they were walking to was so much better than the slavery that they left behind. But still, they had to trust God and leave. I wonder, do we realise that that will be required of us too? Is our allegiance to this world such that we see this as our home and we dread the day when God will call us to leave? Interesting, I was talking to Steve about this the other week, and sometimes we don't talk about this rightly. We act as if this world and our communities don't really matter, or that heaven is just some remote place that God isn't going to return and rebuild this world as a new perfect earth. To be clear, we need to be invested in our communities and our culture. But when we are called to choose between God's kingdom and the kingdom of this world, when we are called to lay down our possessions, our positions, and our ambitions for the sake of taking up our cross, there should be no competition. Is Christ our hope in life and death? Because if he is, then to live is Christ and to die is gain. So whether living or dying, we follow him. Chapter 13, verse 19, we read this. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and shall carry up my bones with you from here. Hundreds of years before the Exodus, Joseph knew that the Exodus would happen. He didn't know when, but he was confident of it. And while he worked for the good of the Egyptians, which he did do, didn't he? He never lost sight of God's plan beyond Egypt. We should be the same. We do not know when Christ will return, but we are confident that he will return. So we work for the good of our communities, but we do not lose sight of where our ultimate home will be in the new earth and the new heaven. Chapter 13, verses 20 to 22. And they moved on from Sukkot and encamped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people. As we follow God, we can be confident that he will go with us. Now, we're not likely to see a pillar of cloud or fire guiding our way necessarily. But I would say we have something far better. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. We have the Bible and the Holy Spirit. So we have no excuse for not seeking God. We have no excuse for not walking in his ways. Now, you might be thinking, hang on, we've gone verse by verse from 12:31 to 41 and then 13 to 17, but what about the rest of it? Well, I wanted to finish with that. So let me outline quickly the bit that we've skipped over. Chapter 12, verse 32, we see that the Lord kept watch, and the Israelites are in remembrance to keep watch each year as a solemn observance to remind them of God's faithfulness. Chapter 12, verses 34 to 51, we read about how the Passover is to be celebrated in future years. In chapter 13, verse 1 to 10, we read about the feast of the unleavened bread. Chapter 13, verses 11 to 16, we read about the consecration of the firstborn. So various celebrations, if you will. Maybe celebration doesn't quite capture the nuance of a solemn observation, but you get the idea. These are events which are to take place each year. And I just want to make 3 simple points. Firstly, the point of these generations is to teach future generations about God. Let me read chapter 13, verses 8 to 10. You shall tell your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Israel. And it shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. And verses 14 to 16, we read this similar thing. And when in the time to come your son asks you, what does this mean? You shall say to him, by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. For when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land, both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of animals. Therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all the males that the first opened the womb, but of the firstborn of my sons I redeem. It shall be a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes. For by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt. I think the application is clear. It's fascinating that these ceremonies are here so that the people will have regular annual reminders of God's faithfulness, which can be passed down through the generations. The idea that these customs will be like a mark on the hand or a sign on the forehead. The mark here is a practice, a custom, something which causes the people to remember what God has done for them. And causes others to ask, why is it that we do this the way that we do it? Gives us an opportunity to explain God's goodness. If you've got a mark on your hand, every time you reach out for something, you see it and remind you. Maybe some of you use that as a way to remind you that you've got to do something. You put a mark on your hand, so every time you see it, it reminds you. I've got a friend, some of you might know him. One of his eyebrows went silver. People started saying to him, why have you dyed your eyebrow? There's a mark on his face. Everyone asks, why are you like this? The answer is, I don't know. In this case, these celebrations exist to set the Israelites apart. We don't celebrate the same way today. But as Christians, God has given us marks which set us apart, hasn't he? We meet together on Sundays as we do now. We are told to give thanks regularly. Maybe we do that before a meal and at other times as well. We are to join for breaking of bread as you did this morning. Does our faith so impact us that it is as if we have a mark on our hands to remind us whose we are and how God has redeemed us? And we have a mark on our face so that people look at us and see something different about us. To give us an opportunity to tell people what it is that God has done, that he has rescued us with a mighty hand. Secondly, verse 42 of chapter 12. We read this. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. Throughout all generations, this is to be a night of solemn observance, because God kept watch to ensure the Israelites' safety. The solemn observance is to remind them of God's care for them. They are to keep watch, not for their own safety, to defend against enemies, but rather to remind the people that God had done that for them when they left Egypt. Similarly, with the Passover, after the first Passover, they're not celebrating this anymore out of fear that the firstborn would die, but rather with gratitude that God had delivered them. They ate the unleavened bread each year, not out of necessity. Not because they didn't have time to break bread, but rather in order to remember what the Lord had already done for them. The consecration of the firstborn is not because God has any ill intention for the firstborn, but rather that this is a reminder of how he had redeemed Israel. Look, here's the point I'm trying to make. The celebrations are symbols. Just like the breaking of bread is a symbol for us. We don't take communion because we need to provide for ourselves. We do it because God has already provided for us. Third point in this second section. Some of this might seem distasteful to us. In Exodus 12:15, which isn't in our passage tonight, but if you read that, you'll see that the people are told that anyone who eats yeast during the feast of the unleavened bread is to be cut off from the people. Seems a bit extreme, doesn't it? I mean, even vegans are more gracious than that. I'm sure if you eat a bacon sandwich, they won't quite cut you off and disinherit you. If you think about the Passover, and what it says here about sacrificing animals to redeem the firstborn son, or breaking the neck of a firstborn donkey if you don't redeem it by killing a lamb, it all seems a bit brutal, doesn't it? Do you know, I think that really is the point. Our sin is serious, and the consequences are serious. If we are rebels running away from God, then we will one day face his wrath. Our sinful rebellion is so serious that it deserves eternal punishment. But our God is so kind that he sent his Son into the world to take the punishment that we deserve for our sin. When we break bread, we have a celebration, a solemn observation, as we remember that God has redeemed us, as we remind ourselves that Jesus died in our place. Shed blood and a broken body may seem distasteful to us today, but that is the cost of our freedom. Jesus has bought our freedom. So will we follow him out of slavery to sin? It won't be easy, but we can be confident that he will provide for us as he leads us to himself. It may also seem distasteful to us that the foreigner is not to eat the Passover unless he has been circumcised. But I think chapter 12, verses 48 and 49 answers that for us. This is really the end of the talk. Let's just look at this quickly. If a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, then he may come near and keep it. Listen, he shall be as a native of the land, but no uncircumcised person shall eat of it. There should be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. See, the foreigner isn't really excluded. It's just that they need to stop being a foreigner in order to be included. If you're coming to Bethel, but you are not a follower of Christ, you are very welcome. But you need to know that you will not be fully included. When we celebrate communion, for example, it's only those who are trusting in Christ who can join. If you have not given your life to Christ, then you're not to eat the bread or drink the wine. But that doesn't mean that you're excluded. It's just honest. Because if you don't partake in the real event that the symbol represents, then the symbol just becomes some quaint cultural thing, which is disrespectful to the reality of what God has done for us. And also dangerous for those who otherwise might trick themselves into thinking they belong to Christ when they are not. Everyone is welcome to take communion, which reminds us of the redemption that we have through Christ. But only if you are trusting in Christ. Everyone is welcome to membership, which symbolizes in many ways being part of God's family. But only if you have first become part of God's family. In the passage here, it talks about circumcision being necessary to share in the Passover meal. Circumcision is a permanent thing, which at the time of the Exodus symbolized a serious decision to follow God, a commitment to be one of his people. Now, we're not called to be circumcised today. The New Testament makes that very clear. But we are called to be circumcised of heart, if it were. We're to give our lives to God. A serious, permanent commitment. Not saying that we're going to be perfect, but we do commit to strive to follow Christ, and that we will trust in him, and that we want him to transform us into his new people. That we want new hearts and renewed minds. That we will, if you like, leave Egypt and walk towards God. And while we might get distracted, we might fail sometimes, we will never turn back. We will keep walking towards God. There's so much going on in these verses, and we are finishing now. And I've hardly done it justice. And I can only apologise for that, but I trust that God will speak to us through something in his word tonight. As I was reading through my notes earlier, I thought this is not very concise. There's so much stuff that I've not said, and there's so much stuff that I have said that I may not have said clearly. If I could just sum it up. The Israelites had to believe, they had to act. They had to have faith, even when God called them to do something which must have at the time seemed very scary. But they didn't escape Egypt by their power or their might or their cleverness. They were freed from slavery through no work of their own, but instead by God's mercy and goodness. God put in place practices to ensure that the people would not forget what he had done for them. We may not be slaves in Egypt, but we are slaves to sin. And God has worked a great miracle to free us in entering into our world to bear our sin on the cross. Will we give ourselves to him? Will we trust him? Will we receive the freedom that he offers? If so, then we should regularly, soberly remember the price that he has paid for our freedom. And we should joyfully live our lives for his glory in the light of his grace. Before we close in prayer, we're going to sing our final hymn, which is